Advertising fraud, is this something that you really need to be concerned about? This is something that's more for the consumer guys, right? Not necessarily. This is increasingly growing to be a problem across both consumer and B2B sides, and there may be a time when you're a victim of this and you don't even know it. There's a major publisher in our community, serves the financial markets. They started getting some inquiries from their advertisers about invalid traffic. What was going on here, that you were not really delivering on these impressions. Turns out that not only were their advertising impressions being stolen, their entire content was being lifted off their site and being repurposed elsewhere. So when advertisers who are getting smarter, more informed, when they start asking about invalid traffic, you need to be able to have that conversation and have some solutions. Very excited to welcome Augustine Fou, Dr. Augustine Fou, who's a cybersecurity researcher. He's going to talk a little bit about the landscape for advertising fraud and also share some specific steps that you can take to combat this. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Good afternoon. I'm glad you all stuck around to hear about ad fraud. But thank you very much for taking the time. Who has heard about ad fraud? All right, everyone's heard about ad fraud. Who thinks we've solved ad fraud? Okay. Who here is working on solving ad fraud? Excellent. Okay, so at least we have one. But some of the stuff that I'm going to share with you today is based on the research that I've done over the last 5 years. So I've been in the digital marketing industry for about 23 years now, right after leaving McKinsey in the mid-90s. Got into the trenches of the internet in New York and kind of have witnessed the entire arc of digital advertising, digital marketing. And unfortunately, I'll have to tell you, the promise of digital has not yet been fulfilled. Right? So just like Steve was saying earlier, digital has the promise of delivering the right ad to the right person at the right time. However, we haven't achieved that goal yet, because right now, from what I'm seeing in the data, there's a ton of bad activity. There's bad guys bots. Right, so Adam mentioned earlier talking about bots, but he was mentioning the good kind of bots, like the chat bots that they use to interact with consumers. I'm talking about the bad guys bots that are basically ripping off publishers and stealing ad revenue out of our digital ecosystem. And furthermore, when those bots generate traffic and impressions and clicks, all of those things get recorded in analytics. And unfortunately, that messes up all of our analytics. Right? So when we try to build strategies on those analytics, it's going to be wrong as well. So what I'm going to show you today are charts taken from our direct data. I'll give you some context around the fraud problem. So you might have read about the size of the fraud problem in many different publications. Everyone's probably written about it by now, but all those numbers are wrong. Okay, bottom line is those big numbers have so many assumptions in them that they're probably not going to be applicable to your situation. So what I always tell clients to do is really measure your own situation, right? So whether it's a publisher measuring the bots that come to their own site or an advertiser measuring the impact of bots and fraud on their own campaigns. That's what matters, because once you have that data, you can actually go do something about it. All right. So let me start at the very high level. And as you can tell from the title, I'm going to end with a very positive note, because for the first time in years, I actually see light at the end of the tunnel. Right? I actually think good publishers, like the ones in this room, are going to save digital advertising from itself. Okay. So let me explain why. So all the publishers have heard about ad fraud, and basically it's super simple, right? It's ad impressions caused by bots, so they generate the ad impressions, and never seen by humans. So for all intents and purposes, it's not going to yield any kind of ROI for your advertisers, your customers, all right? But unfortunately, in my travels and speaking to a lot of publishers, most of them still don't think it affects them. The reason why they don't think it affects them is because they've done some bot measurement. They put bot detection on their own websites and saw that there was very little bots, right? Very small percentage of bots. That's true. However, the bots don't come to those good publisher sites in mass quantities because they can't make money there, right? But what they do is they come to those sites and they collect a cookie, and then they go elsewhere to generate thousands upon thousands of ad impressions. So in doing so, they're actually diverting ad revenue away from good publishers' websites. right? So taking this chart to just give a little bit of context, you look at the digital ad spend, right? So according to the IAB, there's about $83 billion being spent this year. And if you subtract out Google and you subtract out Facebook display, you're left with that middle portion, so roughly a third. So roughly a third of the digital ad spend is left over for good publishers to draw from, right? So now that pool is being attacked by the bad guys as well. And what they're doing is they're diverting that ad revenue to what I call sites that carry ads. I don't even call them publishers because they're not. Right? There's no content. They didn't work to create the content. There's no humans, right? There's no audience that goes there because there's no content. There's nothing for humans to read. Humans would never go there anyway. And they can sell it at low CPMs because they don't have the cost of content, right? So they're selling it at super cheap prices, and it's kind of unfair to you because you're trying to compete while you're actually creating real content, right? Creating real content that real humans want to read is very hard. It's very time-consuming. It's very expensive. These guys cheat, so it's an unfair fight. Okay, so the fraud diverts the revenue to the fake sites, and let's put a little more context around that. VeriSign at the end of 2016 reported 329 million domain names having been registered. If you think about the Alexa top million, so these are the top largest sites where they have some tracking. If you just take the top million, that should account for most of the sites that humans visit. So just think about your own habits. You're probably going to go visit a small handful of sites every day, probably the mainstream ones like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, so on and so forth. And then you might visit a couple of these long-tail sites. So let's be generous and let's take the next 10 million sites by size and add those in, right? So collectively we have 11 million. That still leaves 318 million domains where we're just not sure, right? Do they actually have any humans? Do they actually have a human audience? Probably not. But let's just roughly take half of those, right? Half of those carry ads, the other half doesn't carry ads. So then you're left with 159 million sites that carry ads. That's about 15 times the number of good publishers' sites that are competing for that finite bucket of dollars, right? If you look closely at some of those domain names on there, these bad guys, they don't even care to make those domain names easy to remember or easy to type in. It just has to be a domain name because once they register it, they can stick some ads on there using ad tech and they can start making ad revenue. Okay, so in this case, you can just see all those are fake sites that are competing for those same ad dollars. And oh, by the way, mobile fraud also steals money from that same pot. So you compound the problem, and in addition to the 159 million sites that carry ads, think about the mobile side of things. There's about 7 million apps at the latest count, most of which carry ads, right? So 96% of them carry ads. But again, if you think about your own habits, right? I'll use a Facebook study and a Spotify study. Their studies show that most humans have 15 to 25 apps installed on their phone at any given time. And they typically use 5 to 8 of them on a daily basis, like Facebook, like Pandora, like Spotify. So what are those other 6.999 million other apps? Right? Why do we need all of them? We'll even take one other example, right? You heard of Pokemon Go, right? Came out last year. And during the summer, it just came out of nowhere and it became the biggest phenomenon, right? My kids downloaded it and they used it. But by the end of 2016, by Christmas time, it had basically petered away. So that's what the normal decay curve looks like for even one of the most popular apps that in recent memory, right? So what are those other 6.99 million, right? We'll show you some other app names that will just make you scratch your head. How can that be a real app that people downloaded? So again, mobile fraud also steals ad dollars out of this bucket, and you're competing with that. And then just look at some of these fake sites. It's hard to read, but you don't really need to read it because on the left-hand side, those are all fake sites. They're just alphanumeric strings, right? 36 characters long. No human would ever type that in. No human could even accidentally go to these sites. So they have no human traffic, right? Maybe a baby on a keyboard, like just typing like this, and then they add a .com at the end, they'll get to it, okay? But no human would actually get to those, okay? And then look at some of the fake app names on the right-hand side. These are all fake. And because they're fake, there's no cost of content, there's no real audience. That's why they can sell their inventory, right? They don't call it an audience, they call it inventory. That's why they can sell their inventory for low prices. And now they're offering CPMs that are far lower than you guys can, and so therefore they're siphoning those dollars away. So as long as advertisers keep buying cheap CPMs because they think they're doing their job, they're going to start putting more and more money into the pockets of the bad guys. Okay, so we have to educate the advertisers as well. So fraud is successful. It basically continues to be successful because this is not a recent phenomenon, right? Ad fraud has been going on for ages, but this is the recent manifestation of it. And with programmatic, because we've now automated so many things, it's actually made it easier and more automated for the bad guys to commit the fraud as well. Okay? So the fake sites are still able to sell their ads because they know they can trick measurement and they can trick reporting. So the two on the left-hand side are examples of how they trick measurement, right? So you heard of viewability measurement, you've heard of NHT or non-human traffic, so bot measurement. Both of those can be tricked, right? So the first example would be, okay, they can show you 100% viewability. That's no problem because the bad guys will cheat and they'll stick all their ads above the fold anyway, right? As good publishers, you can't do that. You don't do that, right? You actually put the ads, array them on the page, so some will end up above the fold, others will end up below the fold. That's what good publishers do. So for example, for a good publisher, if the page has one ad above the fold, one on the side, and one on the bottom, their starting viewability is 50%. So I keep telling WPP and Group M that 100% viewability is actually not a realistic goal. 50% is a realistic goal because that's what real publishers are able to show. And there's actually some research that came out today from White Ops that corroborates that. So 100% viewability, if you're striving for that and you're insisting only on that, you're actually increasing your risk of being exposed to fraud because the bad guys cheat. In the middle is an example of where they can trick the bot detection as well. So they show up as 0% non-human traffic, but it's fake. Because now there are bots that are sophisticated enough to defeat every single one of those fraud detection companies. So therefore, there are traffic sellers that are now openly selling IAS compliant traffic, forensic compliant traffic, pixelate compliant traffic, double verify compliant traffic, because they know for sure their bots get by all of them. So then when an advertiser asks, oh, well, what did double verify say? Oh, it looks fine. It's 0% or 3% NHT. That's not because it's actually 3% NHT. It's because the bad guys' bots got by and got marked as clean. Okay, so they're tricking measurement. And the last thing is tricking the reporting systems. So to the advertisers, when they look at their own placement reports, they'll think it's clean placement. Again, not because it's clean placement, meaning it showed up on a good site. It could have actually shown up on one of these fraud sites or an unsavory site, a fake news site, and all that kind of stuff. But when they pass a variable like UTM source equals L.com, they basically pretend to be a mainstream publisher like L.com, or in fact one of your sites. That's how they kind of hide. That's how they launder the impression so that they can pretend that it's coming from a good publisher. Because if you saw that it came from one of these fake sites, it'll be just too obvious, right? You'll pick that out and you say, oh, I don't want to pay for that. But when they pretend to be one of these big sites, you don't know, right? So that's how they trick the analytics reporting as well, so that, again, all three of these things combined are enabling the bad guys to continue to sell fake impressions, and they're not getting caught. So the current detection, I'll just spend a minute on this. Current detection is severely limited. So you've heard of all these ad tech companies that come out and detect fraud and bots. Okay, they're all fine and good. They all mean well. They have nice technology. However, it's limited by where the measurement takes place. So in my research, you can basically see there's three main areas where fraud detection can be done: in-network, in-ad, and on-site. In-network means, our previous speaker was talking about programmatic. So when the bid comes in, you have a site and a user to look at. If the detection service has seen the website before and they know it's a bad site, they know not to serve the ad. If they've seen the user or the cookie before and they know it's a bad guy, right, they know not to serve the ad. However, in most of the cases, they would have seen neither before, because the bad guys are very good at taking down websites when they're not productive for them anymore, and the bad guys' bots are very quick at dumping a cookie and then getting a new one. So for most of the cases, for the vast majority of the cases, they haven't seen either before, so that the default action is to let the ad serve. So most everything gets by that form of detection simply because of the limitations of where that measurement is being done. In the middle is the second most common form of fraud detection, and that's where we have the tracker in the ad itself. So when the advertisers come in and send their ad in, they typically have the fraud detection riding along with the ad impression. But when that ad serves, it's usually in the iframe of the ad, not on the page. So if you're familiar with browser security, the contents of one iframe can't talk to or look at the contents of another iframe. That's basic browser security. So if the tracking tag is in that foreign iframe, it can't see anything on the page. Therefore, it can't tell where the ad slot is on the page, so it can't measure viewability. It can't do brand safety measurements either, because it can't look at the content on the page and see if there's adult keywords and things like that. So all those fraud detection companies that represent they can do brand safety are over-representing what they can actually detect. And that's basically because of the limitations of where the measurement takes place. And the last part is on-site measurement. So as an example, Moat has their embed code on the most publishers. So they have the most complete information about, for example, where the ad slots are for viewability measurement, as well as the most complete information about the user that's hitting that page. So they also have some NHT detection. So in that case, this form, the on-site measurement, is the most complete, but it is actually the rarest because most advertisers don't have the luxury of putting embed codes or tracking tags on the publisher sites, okay, especially the bad guy sites because they won't let any kind of fraud detection tracking on their own sites. So again, the moral of the story here is that the current forms of detection are great, but they are severely limited based on where the measurement takes place. So again, they're not going to catch everything. Here's another problem that I think you guys will also face, and that is fake inventory sold on exchanges. So this is one of my medical publishers. Basically, she runs a small medical site where we know that on a monthly basis, she can sell 14 million ad impressions. She sells all of those through a private marketplace run by one of the agencies, and it's all for pharma clients. And she doesn't sell anything on open exchanges. But yet, when you look at DBM, so double-click bid manager to kind of do your planning, you can see a whole handful of exchanges offering 8.6 million impressions per day that purportedly come from her site. That's not from her site. These are all fake inventory pretending to be a medical publisher in order to attract pharma dollars. So there will be equivalents in your space as well, because once you start going into programmatic, other people can simply pretend to be your site. Because in this case, when you're doing the planning, the ad hasn't run yet. So basically, those exchanges rely on 2 bits of information, the site and the cookie. Right, so those 2 bits of information are declared. Those are passed into the exchange. So a bad guy, right, if they passed in their real domain name, would you buy on their site? Probably not, right? But if you see it's a credible medical publisher or one of your titles, you want to buy that. But in fact, it's not your inventory. It's some bad guy pretending to be you. So that's why I see a lot of cases where the advertisers come in and accuse my publishers of a lot of bots and fraud. But they said, well, that can't be because we're measuring on the site. There's no bots on there, or there's very little bots. What's happening there is that the advertiser's buying fake inventory, and they measure a lot of bots, and then they call up ESPN, they call up one of my small medical publishers and ask her, what's going on? So that's an effect of what's happening here, which is basically bad guys pretending to be your site in order to attract high-value pharma dollars. Okay? So fake inventory is being sold on exchanges as well. And then finally, fake audiences. So I think this will be the point that's most pertinent to a B2B audience. So earlier we heard that B2B might be a little bit more immune to this kind of stuff. You're not. Okay, basically in this case, let me show you an example. The bots are going to sites like Journal of Clinical Oncology. They're going to New England Journal of Medicine. They're going to all these different websites in order to build up a cookie profile. So in this case, they appear to be an oncologist. And so when an advertiser wants to target oncologists, they can now go into the exchanges and use cookie targeting and say, oh yeah, let's go retarget these oncologists because they visited all these websites. But in this case, it's not actually an oncologist. It's a bot pretending to be an oncologist. So therefore, they can actually attract even more dollars through retargeting and therefore help the fake sites earn even more money. So in your case, be very careful about the audiences, right? So bots can actually pretend to be your premium audiences in order to go elsewhere to generate ad revenue. That's, again, how they're diverting ad dollars away from you. Okay, so we talked about, some of the previous speakers talked about data management and enrichment. So if you have a case where you can take an offline profile, so you can see an offline event, bots can't do stuff in the offline world. So if you have an event in the offline world and you can use that to match to a profile, that's a great way for you to confirm that that's actually a human and not just a bot visiting the site and pretending to be that premium audience. Okay, so keep that in mind. Fake audiences are also diverting ad revenue. So what can publishers do? Right, you guys have done a lot already. Good publishers have complied with standards, they've put measurement in place, and in fact, over the years, we've seen publishers add in tons and tons of measurement, right? All these tracking pixels publishers have put on their site. However, advertisers still don't trust them because the publishers are paying for the service. So what do? The advertisers now send in more pixels, right? That's coming in through the ad unit. And so when you look at all of those pixels or those tracking tags they have to fire, that's what's causing a bad user experience. Right now the user is hit with 50 trackers and it slows down the page loading and all that kind of stuff. So all of this, because of the distrust, it's causing a bad user experience. Right? So that when the advertiser sends in more tags, it makes the matter worse. But despite the measurement, it hasn't done right by the publisher because there's still bad measurement. So remember I mentioned based on where the measurements are done, there could be severe errors in the measurement. So in this case, this was exactly this. For bots, one publisher called me up and said they needed help because they were being accused of high bots. So we ultimately put our code onto the site next to another detection service. And you'll see in terms of sources 1 and 2, the numbers pretty much corroborate, right? The deltas or the differences are 1%, 3%, 5%. But notice source 3. It's 300% difference, 1,000% difference. There's even an 8,000% difference. Source 3 is completely off because first of all, they were measured in the ad slot, right, in the ad iframe, not on the page. And it looks like they were triple counting, quadruple counting the bots. So there were more bots than there were even page impressions, right? So in this case, we could actually clearly show that the measurements were wrong. But unfortunately, those incorrect measurements are still wrongly accusing publishers that they have high bots, right? And we still have to deal with that. And then the example on the right-hand side is where viewability is also measured incorrectly. So in this case, because the tags are in the iframe and it can't look outside of itself, even though the entire page is in a 1x1 iframe, it can't tell that. So it'll still report that as 100% viewable when it's actually not. So these are just examples to show you how measurement can be tricked or can simply be wrong, okay? And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, bad ad experiences by the users or from the users cause them to load ad blockers, right, install ad blockers. And when they come to your sites, the ad blockers are still on. So that's actually continuing to cost you more ad revenue because your ads can't run either, okay? So just keep that in mind. Bottom line is this has caused an imbalance, or there is an imbalance in the industry right now, because while the advertisers are fighting with the publishers, the consumers are completely left out. Right, so one of our previous speakers talked about the consumer and how we need to take their needs into account, right? So when we're focused on the needs of the consumer, like the New York Times, right? Alice was talking about focusing on the consumer's needs and how do we best serve them. A lot of times these ad tech companies don't even take them into consideration. And in fact, a lot of the tracking that goes on the sites are to collect data about the consumers. The consumers don't even know what's being collected of them, let alone have the ability to check it, or delete it, or ask for it to be deleted, right, or corrected or deleted. So in this case, there's a fundamental imbalance at play in digital right now. And then finally, tech and standards over the years have still not solved the problem, right? There's great tech, right, like Moat, and there's great standards set by the MRC, but neither of those have solved fraud, right? It still exists, it's still rampant, so there's something else that's going on. So I kind of summarize it this way. The problem is not the lack of measurement, right, or the lack of technology. We got plenty of that. The problem is the lack of trust. Okay, so how do we solve that? Let me propose something. Let's think about this what if. What if we bifurcate good publishers from others, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I don't call those other sites publishers because they're not. They're just sites that carry ads. So what if we separated good publishers from everybody else? Right, the good publishers on the left-hand side, some of those are the sites that you've heard of. And then on the right-hand side, again, those are the sites where, those are the alphanumeric domain names that nobody's going to even accidentally go to. So there's no content, or there's stolen content like we heard about before. There's fake content, or just no content at all. All they are doing is buying traffic in order to generate those ad impressions. So what if we bifurcate those two groups? Because the reason we have to do that is it really comes down to intention. So hopefully I've shown you that technology detection alone can be defeated, right? So we have to have tech, but just know that it can be defeated. So we also have to look at business practices, because the bad guys, if they choose to commit fraud, they will definitely find the technology to defeat your viewability measurements, to defeat your NHT measurements, and so on and so forth. right? So it has to be both. It has to be analysis of the business practice of the publisher. Like the publishers in this room have good business practices. The bad guys don't, right? The bad guys cheat all the time. So what we're trying to do is differentiate those two. So when we are able to look into the business practices of the publishers versus the sites that carry ads, we will also be able to see that in the data. Because again, if there are good business practices already being done, then the end result is what you see on the left-hand side. The good publishers, there's going to be a lot of blue, right? So in our charts, blue means humans, red means bots. So you can see that's a good-looking chart. There's a lot of humans. For example, some of those best practices would be don't source traffic, don't do audience extension, and things like that. Whereas on the right-hand side, they do all of those things, right? Because again, it comes down to their intent. The bad guys intend to cheat, and they can find technology to help them do that. Okay? So let me show you some other examples of what good publishers do. You can see from this example, we also track to a conversion event, a phone call. So this was for a medical a client of ours, and basically we tracked the calls. When you look at the humans coming from, okay, you see the page source 1 and page source 2, you have visits coming to the site. So we're now measuring for humans versus bots. So then when you multiply, say, the 47,000 visits by the percent that's dark blue, you're going to get the 30,000 humans that ultimately got to the site. So the 30,000 humans drove 1,000 calls, and the 3,000 humans drove 100 calls. So that's a straight line correlation between humans and the conversion event that we care about. So again, it shows that the humans are the ones doing the conversion event. You can also see the quality of the two organic sources as well. So good publishers have humans, and advertisers value those humans. So just like Steve was saying earlier, right, we need to convince the advertisers, but hopefully we'll have the data to also back it up to say, if we have human audiences and we can show that to you, that's going to lead to better ROI, better business outcomes. So in this case, just looking at case A or example A versus example B, you'll see the difference between starting with good publishers that have a lot of human audience. So when we measure the ads, we can show that they're shown to humans. Then when we measure the arrivals, we can see that mostly humans click through to the landing page. And finally, on the right-hand side, when we measure the conversions, we can also see in that third donut chart, it's mostly blue, because humans do those conversions. In case B, if we start with less clean media, so for example, when we go on the open exchanges, there are some humans there. I'm taking a middle-of-the-road case. I'm not even taking an extreme case here. But there are some humans, but there's lots of other stuff, like the red, like the bots, and some white, which means we can't measure it. That's leading to a slightly lower number of arrivals, and you'll see the nature of the arrivals on the landing page is very different, right? Only 15% of them are blue, and there's also some bots clicking through. But then when we go all the way through to conversions, you'll see it's a very small number, but even then it's still all blue because only humans do those conversions. So again, the moral of the story here is that the advertisers actually want the human audiences that convert. And then you might have heard of this recent example, right? Some advertisers are taking action. So in this case, Chase started taking programmatic in-house, so they could see their own numbers instead of relying on an agency to do that for them. And in this case, their CMO came out and said, we reduced our ad placements on 400,000 sites to now 5,000 sites. And there was zero change to their business outcomes. Right? That's a 99% reduction in reach. However, it wasn't real reach. It wasn't real human reach. Right? It was just reach. They just put it out there as far and wide as possible. What matters is real human reach, and you, the good publishers, have the human audiences. Okay, so in this case, the advertisers taking action. So finally, how do we tell good publishers from other? One of the things I have the privilege of working on is the quality certification process with the AAM. And the key part of this is that it combines both business practice review as well as technology detection. So like I mentioned earlier, if the bad guys chose to do bad and chose to commit ad fraud, they can find the technology, right? But that's going to be revealed in the business practice review. So it's important to start looking at the business practices. Do they source traffic? Do they do audience extension? Do they auto-refresh the page, and so on and so forth? So that's one part. And at the end, you also have to have technology to verify that. So again, like I showed you earlier, if you have good business practices, the end result is you're going to have good-looking data. Right, so we need both of those, right? Not either or. And then so let me show you a few examples from the charts. So good publishers are taking proactive action to reduce bots. So in the first case, again, blue is humans, red is bots. Publisher 1 stopped buying traffic. You can see that in the data. You can see when they stop doing that. In the second case, you'll see publishers started filtering data center traffic. Right, so again, humans don't access the internet through data centers. So when you see a visit coming from a data center, it's probably not a human. It's a bot coming to scrape your page. So in this case, when they started their filter, you can see that in the data, okay, when the red goes down. The next thing is the good publishers act to protect their advertisers. So this is an example where the filtering of the bots coming from data centers is actually now showing up as the publishers helping to protect their advertisers' ads from being exposed to these bots. So the bots are still going to come, right? So you have a website, bots are going to come to your site, and you can't really prevent it. And sometimes they're coming to collect a cookie, or you've heard of DDoS attacks. They might overwhelm a site with traffic. In this case, the bots are still going to come. However, if you have the correct defenses in place, like the filtering and the blocking, then the end result is you filter out most of those, and you're left with a lot less red there. And so these are actions that good publishers would take to protect their advertisers, so that when the ad serves, it's not going to be exposed to those bots. Good publishers also protect their users. So in this case, we talked about the trackers, right? That's what led to a whole bunch of ad blocking. In this case, there are a couple of publishers that have drastically minimized the number of trackers on their page. And you can see the obvious benefit would be the load time of the page, but also for the users, it's like their personal information is not being collected and siphoned off and being used elsewhere. So again, getting back to the B2B audiences here, you have valuable users coming to your websites. Do you want to allow a third party to put a tracker on your site and steal all that information and not compensate you for that? Right, so just like Alice was saying earlier, every piece of content should be monetized. You ought to get your rightful profit from that. In this case, your audience is one of your core assets. And other trackers, other third-party trackers are coming on your site and siphoning off all that data. And they're buying and selling it and making money off of it without compensating you. So basically what a new deal looks like, so we talk about current digital advertising, it's broken because it doesn't take the third piece of that puzzle into consideration. That's the consumer. In this case, the new deal actually benefits all parties. So if good publishers, or if advertisers can see better outcomes because their ads are being shown to humans, good publishers will actually now make more ad revenue because the advertisers will value that. And most importantly, the third piece of that, to complete the puzzle, consumers will have better experiences. So especially those high-value audiences that come to your sites will have a much better experience because they're not bombarded with 50 trackers, 100 trackers, and slow load times. Okay? So the new deal means everything is balanced between these three parties. And then just to give you the context, I think publishers have a 2 to 4x revenue upside. Again, this is taking a macro view. For some of your publications, it might be way larger than that, because right now so much of the ad revenue is being diverted away from your sites. And finally, once we start cleaning this up, there's also going to be lower supply chain costs, because again, when we talk about the digital supply chain, all of these ad tech players, the fraud detection players, all of those cost money. Right, so when we clean up the ecosystem, some of those supply chain costs are also going to go down. When the consumers have better experiences on your sites, you can ask them to whitelist and they'll be happy to do that. So we also solve the ad blocking problem. So finally, as next steps, let's talk about doing some measurements. So like I said at the very beginning of the talk, what really matters is the amount of fraud and bots that impact your sites, not these big numbers that you read in the industry. We're also doing research right now, so the ROI research, one chart of which you saw earlier, where we can show to the advertisers more humans are going to lead to more business outcomes for you, whatever the conversion event. So I was going to offer to everyone in the audience here, through Connective, we're going to do some ROI research. We're currently doing some, but we can have a few more advertisers join in, so we can actually have the data to show to the advertisers that because of our audiences, right now when you're buying cheap CPMs, you're not even getting human audiences, so your ads are not being shown to humans. When you work with our publishers in this group, you're going to have your ads shown to the right audience. So let's do some of that research together. And finally, certification, where a third party comes in to audit the business practices, as well as have technology to do the measurement. And those two things combined will help you show clean human audiences to your buyers. So thank you very much.